Hello, BookTube. I want to talk about my reading history. I want to make this video in part because I sense the possibility of a change happening in my reading. So, since I became an adult reader as a preteen, my reading has been eclectic but dominated by periods in which specific genres or groupings of genres dominate my reading. It started when I was 11 with mysteries. From the age of 11 to 15, I could not get enough mysteries. It started with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories and expanded to a good chunk of the work of Agatha Christie, Earl Stanley Gardner, The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins, Patricia Cornwell's work, or some of it, P.D. James, Colin Dexter, and expanded to thrillers as well, Minette Walters, and spy fiction, Ian Fleming, and the Bond continuations by John Gardner and Raymond Benson. But when I turned 15, I completely lost interest in mysteries. And for decades, I barely read any. I think I reread some Christie. I read Hound of the Baskervilles. I reread The Moonstone. I had to go at The Maltese Falcon and two works by Chandler. The one with the sisters, and I think the one where the ex-con hires Marlowe to find his ex-girlfriend. I think, and I hated all three of those. And then about 10 years ago, give or take, I rediscovered Agatha Christie after a decade or more of not having read her. And it ignited a brief sort of renaissance, nothing like what it was when I was during this mystery phase or reign. And I'm now currently on the outs with her again. In fact, I'm kind of over the past year been thinking maybe I could get rid of these omnibus editions I have, because while when Agatha Christie works, when I'm really enjoying her work, there's this delightfulness to it, this in spite of the subject matter. When it doesn't work, it just doesn't work, and I just cannot get into it. And the last two times I tried to read Agatha Christie, I just could not get into it. So maybe so I think I'm pretty much on the outs with her again, and have been for about over a year now. So when mystery fell or passed on, I had for a number of years two dominating sort of forces in my reading. The shorter of the two are those genres I call classics, canonical, modern, and contemporary fiction, poetry, and drama. I was an English lit major. I aspired to an academic career, and at the time, in my late teens and early 20s, I really loved not only the classics and the canonical, but also a lot of modern and contemporary fiction, poetry, and drama. And this lasted through my late high school years and through my college years. And once my college years were over, I basically lost interest in and no longer found much of this grouping of literature interesting or enjoyable to read. Although periodically I do have the desire to read classics, canonical, modern, contemporary fiction, poetry, and drama, although sometimes that's a mistake because they don't quite work out, and sometimes they do. But I'll get to that a bit later. But the longer of the two, the more enduring of the two, is science fiction and fantasy, which lasted for 20 years, or 21 years. And science fiction and fantasy is interesting because it's the genre I most identify with. Science fiction and fantasy, mostly fantasy, formed just a core aspect of my identity as a reader. And in a way as a person too, I guess. I mean, I started as a kid, and then here in this 21-year period, and generally speaking, I'm still very much science fiction and fantasy oriented, even if at the end of 2019 and into the subsequent years, my interest in, my enjoyment of adult prose science fiction and fantasy has declined and withered. And I guess in a way that while with mysteries I could basically, okay, I'm not interested, move on. With science fiction fantasy, since it had been such an integral part of my reading, such a dominating part of my reading for so long, that when I started to lose interest, it just, in enjoyment, it just bugged me. And I don't think I really handled it all that well. But I've come to accept it, I think, although there's always the hope that I'll rediscover my love for it soon, but we shall see. So that was at the end of 2019 and into 2020. And I started to sort of at this point, and when I started my YouTube channel, or actively became a booktuber, I guess you could say, my reading started to get a bit, I don't know, necessarily chaotic, but there really wasn't a single dominating force, sort of like how science fiction and fantasy had been for so long. I mean, the first of the sort of a three-part or three-way conflict or sort of dominating aspect of my reading is history. Now, I've always been a history reader, but for the most part, my enjoyment of history largely came from the creative inspiration that it gave me. I want to write science fiction. Well, I want to write fantasy stories. And history always, so whenever I read history, there's always a how can I make this into a fantasy? How can I use this to tell a fantastic story? But over the course of 2020, I began to love history for itself, for the writing, for the narrative it told about these events. And in a way, I think history had been, in this period of chaos that's kind of still going on, had been the dominant reading, the dominant genre I was interested in, at least for the early part. Around the same time, a little bit later, I started to get back into manga, which are Japanese comic books. I had a brief period about 10 or more years ago where I collected manga. Nowhere near as large a collection as I have right now. But I read, I think late in 2020, I read the first 17 volumes of Fairy Tail and the first 7 volumes of The Seven Deadly Sins and absolutely had a blast. And that just reignited my love of manga. And subsequently, I have basically built in the course of 3 or 4 years a collection of manga that is several hundred volumes strong and is likely to grow even larger. in the foreseeable future. And then also classics, canonical, modern, and contemporary fiction, poetry, and drama is once again trying to make a comeback. Now, in a way, I think that from the end of my college career, like when classics, canonical, modern, contemporary fiction, poetry, and drama, kind of like I lost interest in it initially, through to really discovering BookTube. I was okay with, occasionally reading a work of contemporary fiction or rereading View with a Grain of Sand by Wisława Szymborska. But for the most part, I stopped reading what classics, canonical, modern, contemporary fiction, poetry, and drama I had in my collection. But once I discovered BookTube, it came back. And I don't know necessarily if it's nostalgia, if it's just BookTube peer pressure, but periodically since then, I have a strong urge to bolster that part of my library and to engage with it, even if almost certainly, at least when it comes to contemporary fiction, it does not quite, or contemporary literary fiction, let's say that. It does not always work out. There are some times when it does, and I think it's enough to keep me going, but I've made copious videos about this weird, probably somewhat toxic reading relationship I have with some aspects of this group of literatures. But it's, and I'm definitely feeling an urge right now. But like this period of my reading hasn't been necessarily stable. Because while history dominated like the early part of it, I'm definitely sensing that history's definitely on the decline. Over the course of this year so far, I've only really enjoyed 2 works of history that I've actually managed to complete. Everything else I've ended up bailing on, and I'm definitely starting to not want to add as many works of history to my collection as I had, which is something similar that happened with science fiction and fantasy. There would be, when Thomas of SFF 180 would do his mailbags or his sort of preview of the forthcoming year's science fiction and fantasy, I would leave comments saying my poor book budget or my poor wallet because there were so many I wanted. But then now I watch them and I don't add anything, and I haven't in years. And that's sort of kind of starting, I'm getting that sense with history right now. So I don't know if this is another taste change or just my reading right now is kind of chaotic, and give it a few years and then I'm like, okay, in hindsight I can say this is what happened, rather than right now in the middle of it and not really having a firm grasp of how my reading is going. Even though, again, I try to be as eclectic as possible, because if I over binge, it's, yeah. So anyway, I don't quite know how my reading is going to go over the course of the rest of the year. Hopefully, things work out and I have a great reading year. But we shall see. Anyway, part of wanting to make this video was to ask a question, which I'm not entirely sure how to ask, which is, do any of you have something similar in your reading where you do have these dominating periods that change periodically, and how do you cope? Do you just go with the flow, or do you sort of go into existential crisis mode, as I have done for years now? But anyway, BookTube, thank you. Have a great rest of your afternoon, and until I see you next time, stay safe.